Hello, I'm Gerald Finken, and I'm CEO of RxE2, and I'm here to give you the fourth in a series of 8 webinars talking about E2 dispensing. And of course, we're talking about RxE2, which is incorporating the practice of pharmacy into clinical research. And specifically, this E2 dispensing is the dispensing aspect of pharmacy and the changes it's going to make to clinical research that we've been talking about. So in the first few sessions, we talked about patient centricity, we talked about flexibility, and we'll have other discussions. But today, I thought it'd be best to go right into the 5 questions we're asked most of the time, the FAQs about what is, this E2 dispensing, some of the questions that we have surrounding it. What I'd like to do is for you to like this webinar, if you like this series, and also go to the button below and subscribe, or do the notification so that you get notification of the alerts, so that every Thursday, remember to log into this channel so you can learn more about E2 dispensing. Thanks. So here we go. So the first question, we get out there and we start talking about E2 dispensing, and it goes like, E2 dispensing, and we go through the process and they say, really? How does it work? And it's like, well, okay, let's go through it again. It's when we talk about this, it's like we have this behavior, this process, these habits that we've developed about how clinical supplies are supposed to work. And there's a sequence that we get set in our brains, this is the only way it can work. And we have to change that. And the simple thing that we're doing with E2 dispensing is just maybe rethinking about what the building is, the person who's dispensing, and really only doing minor tweaks that actually have the pharmacist, the medication expert, doing the work, instead of trained individuals at the GMP facility or trained individuals at the GCP site. So for instance, we all know in the way this works with E2 dispensing, that in the traditional, we know a manufacturer manufactures clinical supplies and labels it all up and then sends it out to the sites as needed. Right, this kitting and shippers, and it's labeled up and sent to not just one, again, pictorially, we've got to remember, there's 30 sites out there in multiple countries that could be using this stuff. And then the patient comes into the clinical site, picks up their medication, again, just the bottle or a vial or a few vials, and they go home. And that's where then for the week or the month or the several months, they take the medication at home, with sometimes calling into the site, or what's required in traditional sites, going back to the site every single time there's a visit. Now the big thing is the big news out there, we all know about this, is this new, the DCT world, the decentralized clinical trials, decentralized clinical trials. And the difference there is we're saying, let's move some of this function into the patient's home. And that's been working pretty well. So along with that, we said, well, hey, if the patient isn't coming to the site, let's ship drug directly to the patient. But then came the idea, wait a minute, you're shipping drug directly to the patient, you're crossing state lines with medication, and there are regulatory issues associated with that. Just like companies found out when they wanted to do telehealth. A doctor in California can't talk to a patient in Pennsylvania unless they're licensed in Pennsylvania. So the same thing here, if we're going to have medication and we're planning to ship it to the site, that's okay because that's a wholesale, you can do that. But this site has to be licensed in the state. The doctors have to be licensed in the state, nurses have to be licensed in the state, pharmacists have to be licensed in the state. So when you start sending to the patients in the various states, it's like, oh no, let's not do that. We have to be very careful. We need a pharmacist involved. So in ideal situations, we send it to the sites. Pharmacies there are then working with the sites to give it to the patient. But what we say is, in this decentralized direct-to-patient world, we can look at this a little bit differently. Instead of like the pharmacy at each site receiving medication, let's send the GMP material to a pharmacy. That the pharmacy sends it to all the patients out there in the US or in a region or in a country. Slightly different model, but it simplifies it because now you have this one shipment, right? And you don't have to worry about how the sites are storing or kitting, et cetera, because all you have to worry about is what is the patient going to receive? So how it works, right? Does it really work? Is that you send the GMP material just like you've done, you package up unblinded material and you send it to your pharmacy. Now, the pharmacy is unblinded. So remember how easy it is when you have unblinded pharmacies at the site, but the issue is like then you need all 50 sites have unblinded pharmacists? Well now, right, simplify it. We just have one unblinded pharmacy that sends medication to all the sites. So how does it work? We're just changing the idea that you have unblinded pharmacists at each of the sites to one unblinded pharmacist that receives the blinded material, and then they dispense medication to the patients. Now you're going to ask the next question. I know that leads you to the next question. Wait a minute, how does blinding work? You're going to send unblinded material to the pharmacy? Think about it. At the GMP material, at the GMP manufacturing site, they're unblinded. Right? They get active placebo and they go through the process of blinding it, kits at a time, and puts it all in the warehouse. So it's the same thing here at the pharmacy, is that the pharmacy is going to receive unblinded material, and then based upon the IRT notification, randomization schedules, and how they're going to label it, they'll blind it real time. So you have a patient that's going to need medication in Texas, the IRT notification says that patient should receive active. Pharmacist goes and they look, to the randomization, they label up accordingly and send it to the patient, active material, unblinded pharmacist. They need a placebo patient gets their medication. Now, the interesting thing is like with the blinding, so how does blinding work? It's the same way, except the pharmacy's doing the labeling and they're doing the blinding. The key thing about this is that the sites, right, there's no comparison of kit to kit or blocks to blocks, like which active is going to be placebo. It's like, no, the patient's receiving either active or placebo, or active or comparator. So it isn't like there's unblinding going on at the site or trying to figure it out, because there isn't any kits or shippers and stuff to figure it out. It's just the supplies are going directly to the patient. Now, I know there are issues we've got to get around about, like social media, one patient going out there on YouTube or social media and say, listen, my bottle looks like this, but there's that's going to be hard no matter what clinical trials you're doing. We have some of that going on, as we learned, like with the AIDS trials, et cetera, back in the 80s and 90s. The big thing here about the blinding is comparators and how we can re-look at the comparators. Instead of saying that we need thousands of units up front so we can do all the blinding in a GMP facility, think about what you can do with the blinding one-to-one. That first of all, the patient's either going to see the comparator or your product. And then it's just a matter of making sure that the patient doesn't know what the other product looks like. So they may know what the comparator looks like in the marketing material. So it isn't necessary that the blinding has to be so perfect to the your product as the comparators, because the patient, that individual patient, will never see the other product. Think about that, about what we could do there and simplify the way we do comparators. There are some other really cool things when it comes to the blinding and the way we can get away from buying all the comparator up front and kind of do it just one-off, because that same pharmacy that's dispensing can get in touch, can actually get the comparator prescription by prescription. So it goes to the next question then. Wait a minute, you have all these drugs, you send them out, like how are returns handled? Well, the same thing, just because it's a pharmacy, it's handled the same way. It's, they have to account for all the supplies. The principal investigator has to know the disposition of the drug. And so the IRT handles almost all of that. And if not, it can be handled manually pretty easily, because again, the central fill pharmacy, they have inventory, they know what they get in, the blinded material or the unblinded material, active placebo, they know how much they dispense, they can do accountability, they know how much is shipped to a patient, they know how much they get back. So it's really, the similarities are almost identical. So there's really no difference in how this is handled. I can say one of the things you have to think about though is, and when it comes to the labeling, and that might actually be my next one when we talk about it, is the labeling has a patient-specific name on it. I'll wait and I'll get to that. So that when it comes to the returns and reconciliation, if you have the monitors going out, again, they usually go to the sites and monitor. Now we have to consider maybe unblinded monitors that go in and be able to see patient information, which they kind of see anyhow at the, well, I shouldn't say that, no they don't, right? But anyhow, so at the clinical sites when they're there, I mean, think about it, the clinical sites absolutely know who gets what. They know the patients. So the same thing in the pharmacy, central pharmacy, they know which patients are getting it. So the idea of labeling it per patient is pretty cool idea. And so what I look at is the benefits of is the real-time information on these returns. This is coming back real-time. The pharmacist sees it. The next dispensing, the pharmacist is counseling the patient to say, listen, the last time you didn't finish all your medication. What are you going to do? So now, just like at the clinical sites, when a patient brings their medication back and is counseling, this happens real-time with a pharmacist, the medication expert, actually asking the questions instead of the clinical site answering those questions. Another thing people ask about is, well, how are supplies ordered? Well, the same thing, the same way we do in the regular method. You have an IRT sends a notification to the pharmacy, say, that's, dispense some medication. In our model, we like to think about a prescription, which actually does happen at many of the sites. For a doctor to give medication to a patient, they have to write a prescription for it. When I worked at the VA, the PI wrote a prescription, and we then dispensed based upon an unblinding randomization schedule and the prescription. So the doctor didn't know what we were dispensing, but based upon our randomization schedule down in the pharmacy, we knew what to dispense. And of course, that was from the randomization numbers. So how are the supplies ordered at the site, like to the patient, how it's ordered, is the same way you do at a clinical site. There's really no difference between the two. Just because we change the location doesn't mean we change the method. I think I have one more question here. So how much does it cost? And so that's a big thing. It's like, oh my goodness, all this detail is going to send to a pharmacy. That's got to be expensive. Well, this is one of the things, as I mentioned in the previous sessions, that by moving into the practice of pharmacy and working in the pharmacy world, it's a commoditized world. Every minute counts, and pharmacists who are operations expert as well know how to build efficiencies into systems, such that what we've done is we've gone to this new model that I've talked about, ARR pricing, right? And that's like SaaS. So in other words, it's a subscription pricing, not a prescription, but it is kind of really think about prescription subscription pricing. So this model allows us to say, listen, we know the pricing right now. I can tell you, if you have up to 50 shipments at controlled room temperature, 50 dispensing, up to 50 dispensing months, it's $15,000. If your study is going to require up to 150 dispensings a month, it's $37,000 a month, $37,500 a month, controlled room temperature. If you're going to be shipping out to 250 patients a month, up to 250 patients a month, it's $50,000 a month. There's your pricing, done, all inclusive, no other charges. Everything's included in that price. Pretty simple. I realize now that I want to go back and talk a little bit about that labeling because I mentioned it and I realized I didn't really bring it up. The idea is that when you have GMP material and you're sending it to the site, you don't know which patients are getting it. So of course you can't put a patient label on it, patient name on it. But when the sites give it to a patient, they do sometimes put a patient initials or something on it because they know which patient's getting the medication. Now you do that sometimes just because when the monitor comes in and goes to the individual sites, and you have 50 sites, you want to make sure they can look at the supplies of what the patient returned. And you want them to be blinded because they're sponsor represented. You want them to be blinded so they don't know which patient received it. In the model where we go to the pharmacy, all the patients come back. And so the patient name will be on those labels, but there's the idea that you don't know which site, there's a ton of different information. So the idea is that instead of having like a blinded CRA, so that we can have an unblinded CRA for that little minor thing. But you got to remember, you're not doing 50 site visits, you're doing one site visit. And very, very few companies anymore with the sophistication of IRTs are actually counting tablets of what's coming back from the patient. Because that really is the pharmacist's responsibility for adherence and compliance to ensure that that step is done. Really what the CRA should be monitoring is they sent 10 balls of 10 balls of 1,000, how much was used, right? And how much is going to not use, such that there's nothing sitting in inventory here that could accidentally get dispensed to somebody else. Because remember, that's really why we do accountability. The sites, when they receive this medication, it could sit there for months. And so, of course, you want to make sure that supplies doesn't accidentally get shipped because we don't know the safety. Here, it's in a controlled environment in the pharmacy, similar to as it is here. And so the accountability, it's not going to be dispensed to anybody else. I mean, there's a possibility, but it's just not. The controls are here, just like here, that you're not going to ship one protocol and study and medication to the sites, then from another company's medication to the sites. It's just too many controls in place. So it's a little bit unique and different. So I hope that was pretty exciting and had some of your questions asked. Please connect with me on LinkedIn and ask your 10 other questions that you might have had, and I'd be very, very glad to answer those. Thanks very much, and tune in next week where I'm going to be talking about the labeling itself. We're going to go more into that labeling, patient labeling and specific instructions, etc. Pretty good stuff. Right, thank you.